So there are basically three underlying causes for, say, the rise of the far right. One would be the impact of economic globalization, and the fact that economic globalization, while it has benefited some people in the world, has left a tremendous number of people behind, in addition to creating a great deal of economic anxiety, even among those who continue to have jobs, because they no longer have the kind of job security that they once had. And fear of economic loss of status or loss of job or economic security has pushed a lot of people who had previously voted for progressive or left parties over to the far right. The classic example is in France, where voters who had previously supported the Communist Party moved over to support Marine Le Pen and the far right. The second would be dissatisfaction with the major political parties. And the major political parties are basically guilty of two essential sins. And when I say the major political parties, I mean, say, the Democrats and Republicans in the United States, Social Democrats and Christian Democrats and their versions thereof in other countries. The first sin for these mainstream parties is that they supported economic globalization. The left, the right, basically said, this is the economic trajectory. We have to cut government spending. We have to remove obstacles for financial corporations to expand their wealth. We have to remove trade barriers to ensure that goods move as smoothly as possible around the world. Both major parties around the world supported this and have been basically suffering as a result politically at the polls for being associated with what has become an unpopular set of economic policies. The second sin would be corruption, and major parties around the world, with very few exceptions, have been embroiled in one political scandal after another. And we have some of the larger ones, the Panama Papers. Clearly there are as well national scandals that have brought down governments, the Iceland government, the corruption scandal in Austria, the scandals that are embroiling both Shinzo Abe in Japan and Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, scandals here in the United States and Brazil. So corruption has been a major concern by voters that have led them to reject kind of the mainstream options and to search for alternatives on kind of the extremes, if you will, of the political spectrum. And then the third would be cultural, and a concern, particularly among dominant or previously dominant majorities, about the loss of their cultural status. White men, primarily, in countries that are predominantly white, but not exclusively. Certainly the anxieties that Hindus feel in India have contributed to the success of Modi there. A belief on the part of the majority that they will lose their privileges as a result of the demands of minority populations or the influx of immigrant populations. And that has been manipulated by far-right parties to their electoral advantage. So those would be the three kind of underlying causes, I would argue, for the rise of the far right: economic globalization, the sins of the political mainstream, and then anxiety on the part of majority populations about loss of cultural status. In order to ultimately address the far right, I mean, you can show up on the street with placards, you can battle them at the ballot box, you can launch corruption investigations around particular individuals, but ultimately, if you don't address these underlying economic, political, and cultural questions, concerns, then the far right will continue to win at the polls. We might see the loss of a given individual, or loss by a given individual, Trump in 2020, Bolsonaro in the next election, Viktor Orban in the next Hungarian election. But even if they lose, their successor will be well placed to to capitalize on the same underlying concerns that the voters have. What that means, ultimately, if you combine all those three things, those three underlying concerns, is that we have to put together a progressive movement, a progressive party that identifies, articulates a clear economic alternative to the current kind of version of economic globalization, that stakes out clear political territory that's different from the mainstream parties, or at least within a given party that's different from the orthodoxy of that given party, and that addresses cultural issues in a fair and I would say fair and egalitarian manner. Absent, that kind of approach, I think the far right will continue to win. Well, interestingly, I mean, if it was just like, a couple of individuals who had kind of decided that this was a problem and, wrote a couple of articles, I would say, time hasn't come for this kind of response. But I think it's fascinating to see how even mainstream actors have realized that there's a problem. So you have a situation where the IMF and the World Bank, basically the architects of neoliberalism, if you will, have issued reports saying, we made a mistake, I think. We supported policies that have, on the one hand, created economic inequality, and on the other hand, created the conditions within which these intolerant strains have prospered. When you have that kind of response coming from the engines of economic orthodoxy, then suddenly you have much greater leverage as individuals, as citizens, when you're putting together a progressive response. Because your progressive response is no longer, well, we kind of weak, embattled citizens have come up with an economic alternative that only we believe in. No, in fact, there's such a recognition at this point in international institutions, in the academy, and even among many, if not most, governments, that economics as usual is not working. The trick of it is to come up with an economic program that is both sensible and popular. And the right has come up with an economic program that is popular, but not necessarily sensible. Although there are some elements. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the far right's economic program in Poland, it's very popular. It has consisted of economic incentives for families to have more children, which is a challenge in Poland at the moment, but also tax benefits for young people who have difficulty making ends meet in Polish society and therefore basically go overseas or go somewhere else in the EU to make more money. So these are tax incentives to make sure that they stay in Poland and get jobs in Poland. These are pretty sensible, actually, economic suggestions, even though they're coming from a far-right party, and they're pretty popular. For progressives, I think it's necessary to really identify similarly popular programs that are deeply egalitarian in their approach, in the sense that they are designed to lift up communities that are challenged here in the United States, but also offer incentives for everyone, everyone except for the 1%, offer incentives for the 99% throughout society to make an economic contribution to society. That I think is something that progressive movements have to put forward, and both at a national level, but also at a municipal level. I mean, we have a number of really interesting movements. There's the Fearless Cities movement. There's the mayors movement, progressive mayors getting together, looking at how at a city by city level we can implement some of these economic alternatives assess what is successful, what's not successful, what is not successful, and then scale up the successful alternatives so that they can be practiced at a regional and then perhaps national level as well.